Hi scholars, happy Thursday. Today we're starting Unit 8. We just wrapped up A Midsummer Night's Dream. We're reading Chapter 1. Unit 8, you have the reader in the description below. It's called Native Americans, A Changing Landscape. We actually have talked about Native Americans a fair amount this year, or indigenous people. We've talked about them in our lit study novel, Island of the Blue Dolphins. We talked about some different indigenous tribes when we've talked about early American civilizations. Think back to like the Maya, the Aztec, the Inca, these people who are living off the land and the kind of communities that they form. Chapter 1 we're going to be reading today is in the reader below. It starts on page 2. It's called A Long and Winding Road. Before we get to reading that and then taking our guided notes, I have a few things I want to check in first and just give out some general reminders. Checking in first, especially with yesterday's assignment. So yesterday we had our end of play writing assessment. You should have already taken a picture and either submitted that via text or email. My phone number is in the packet right next to where you finished it, and it's also on the front. You can just text a photo of it to me. You can email it, whatever works best for you, just to show that you finished it. Make sure that you finish the sentence starters, but then you also finish the paragraph the paragraph page at the end. All you're doing is combining those sentence starters into a complete paragraph, so it's our final draft. Also, make sure that you're doing your 45 minutes of iReady reading and math this week. So if that's 4 or 5 lessons for you, that's great. If that's 2 or 3, that's okay as well. But when we check the time logs, we're looking for at least 45 minutes in each of the programs. And remember, it only counts that when you're actively answering questions. And lastly, make sure that you watched and read the finale to A Midsummer Night's Dream. So we had our finale that we read, the final monologue, but I also posted the Amplify reenactment video, so you're able to see what that last scene looks like and what Puck's last monologue looks like as well. At this time, I want you to go ahead and get your packet ready for the top Unit 8. We're going to go over our big question, go over our objective for the day, and then start taking some of our guided notes. So our Unit 8 is about Native Americans. The big question for Chapter 1, just for a broad overview, is how did European exploration and settlement of what is now the United States change the way Native Americans lived? So we're looking for at least 1 or 2 ways that their life changed because of Europeans arriving and settling the United States. There's going to be a lot of examples. We're looking for at least one. Some smaller things that we're going to be looking to answer. What are some tribes from the Southwest? So we're looking to identify some tribes. And then what are some of the responsibilities of daily life? So if you were to wake up, what might your day look like from beginning to end? Lastly, our objective and I can statement for the day. I can make inferences about the impact of European settlers and explorers on the lives of Native Americans. You should already be able to make an inference just based on what we know about the past, and especially our country right now. Think about the way our country operates now, what kind of people you see, and how it's structured, and think about how it might have been then. Think about where Native Americans and indigenous people are now compared to where they were in the 1700s. So if you look down below at our guided notes, you notice there's not a header for the introduction. Pages 2 through 5 actually in your reader are an introduction, just giving some background, kind of a little bit of a narrative about the situation and then the setting of America in the 1700s. So before we start taking our first notes over our first section, exploration and settlement, I want you to make sure that you have your reader open in a separate tab and you're able to read along. It's the very first few pages of Chapter 1, A Long and Winding Road. It's going to look like the text is in italics too. I'm going to give you a moment to pause the video, find it, and pull it up before we start reading. Starting at the top of page 2, imagine you were born 300 years ago on America's Great Plains. Back then, there were no big cities or highways. The landscape reveals only wide open prairies with rolling hills, lazy rivers, and endless grassland. Imagine the prairie as your home. Perhaps you are a young Sioux. This is where you were born, and you already know that you will live here all of your life. Everything you need to survive is here, amid the grass and low rolling hills. Food, shelter, clothing, water, fire, friends, family, and sacred places. Everything is here for you. However, even if the prairie contains everything you need to survive, where on the grassy plains do you find food? What do you use to build a house or make a fire? Where do you find water? How do you survive the frigid, icy winters and the scorching summers? The answers to these questions are easy to find, as long as you're willing to learn from those who came before you. The people, your people, have been here for some 10,000 years or more. The wisdom and stories of hundreds of generations is your birthright, the most precious thing you will ever learn. Even think to now, if you wanted to learn something, or if you wanted to figure out the best tips, you would go talk to someone who has done it before. So if it's something like survival, how would I survive in an environment like that? You would talk to the older generations who managed to do it. Just like now, if you were trying to figure out the answer to a question, or if you were trying to figure out how to build or make something, you would talk to someone who's already done it so they can give you some tips, someone with that experience. Continuing on page 3. The elders tell you stories. They teach you about your place in the world, and they provide you the wisdom that is passed down from one generation to another. Your ancestors were the first to walk this land, and they learned to survive here with only their brains, muscles, and courage to sustain them. They were the first to hear the winds and see the waving grass. They found the rivers. You believe their spirits are in the hills and grassy plains and the soil beneath your feet. So the Native Americans believed that they were the spirits and souls of their ancestors and just the world around them and everything. So even down to the grass and hills, that is something that is spiritual to them and somewhat holy because it's what gives them life. It's just like if you were to say that something like water or food is sacred to you because if you don't have it, you die. It's very important. More importantly, your ancestors learned to track and hunt the buffalo. The buffalo provide food, shelter, clothing, fuel for fire, and tools. Out here on the Great Plains, your tribe and all the tribes of the Great Plains depend on the buffalo for survival. We're going to be talking about the buffalo a lot more later on, but that was an incredibly sacred beast just due to how much of it they could use. Go ahead and flip the page to the top of page 4. The tribes of the Great Plains are certainly not alone in the Americas. There are others, and if you walk far enough in any direction, you will find them. North, south, east, or west, there are different tribes in every habitable place. Over thousands of years, they have learned to survive. Let's break down the word habitable. We see habit or habitat. So if you buy a habitat for like a fish or like a hamster, that's somewhere where it can live. If you go to a zoo and you go to like the polar bear habitat, that's their area where they can live. That's their home. Look at the suffix able. If you are able to do something, it means it's possible. So habitable means it's possible to live there. So there's a bunch of different tribes living in a bunch of different places. If you even look at our map on page 4, it says Native American tribes lived in every habitable place. They're all over the United States. Remember one of our big questions was talking about what kind of Native American tribes lived in the Southwest? If we look over in the Southwest, you can see the Navajo and the Pueblo. That's areas like Arizona and New Mexico, a little bit of Texas as well. If you also look towards the northeast, you see tribes like the Huron and the Iroquois. Those are tribes that would have been near where we live now today. Picking up at the top of page 5, in the southwest, you will meet the Navajo, Pueblo, and all the other tribes of the canyons and deserts. Head southeast and you'll find the Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole thriving in the humid woods and swamplands. And the dense, chilly forest to the northeast, there are the Huron and the Six Nations of the Great Iroquois Confederacy. To the west, on the dry, flat plateau between the snowy peaks of the Tejon and Cascade Mountains, you will find the Shoshone and Nez Perce. Farther west, where trees grow as tall as mountains, you may meet the Chinook, the Pomo, and all the other tribes nestled along the western coast. So even just looking at this map, you can tell that a lot of tribes are set on the coasts, on the west and east coast. So when we talk about tribes that are different, when we're talking about the differences between tribes, a major factor is where they're located in the United States. Think about the east, they're on the Atlantic Ocean, and the west on the Pacific Ocean. Kind of where New York City would be on the east, where the Iroquois is, and where California would be in the west. Look at where the Pomo is. Continuing on, some of the people you meet will be your friends. You will share stories with them, and you will trade with them. Some of them will be your enemies, just as they were enemies to your grandparents and your great-grandparents, and they will want to fight. This is the way it's always been, so you'll need to be prepared if you travel from your homeland. If you are like most Native Americans living in the Great Plains, you will find that you are quite happy to stay and live with your family and friends, the members of your tribe. You do not need to wander too far from home. You will live here on the plains forever, tracking and hunting the buffalo, raising children of your own and teaching them how to live according to the ways of your ancestors. Life is just fine here on the plains. You have everything you need and little changes until it does. So we already know that they have a pretty comfortable or a pretty predictable life. That you would be born in a tribe, you would stay there for most of your life because that's what your ancestors did. That's what they know how to do, and that's a safe, secured life. Going out somewhere else is just inviting the possibility to meet one of your enemies and to get into a conflict, or to not have the resources you need to survive. Go ahead and flip to page 6. We're going to start our next header, exploration and settlement. We're going to take some guided notes over this one, so have your pencil ready. Starting at the top of page 6 and 7, exploration and settlement. The year 1492 is a notable date in history, especially American history. Christopher Columbus sailed from Spain in that year to look for a passage to Asia because that is where he thought he would find across the Atlantic Ocean. Instead, he bumped into a new continent. Columbus's voyage triggered what some would call an age of discovery. He's just one of many explorers from Spain, England, France, and other European countries to travel across the Atlantic. So, Christopher Columbus never intended to find America. It was a complete accident. We'll even be able to tell from some of the names they give the inhabitants. At first, the Europeans didn't know what to call this land. Some called it the West Indies because they thought it was a part of Asia. They thought they were in Asia. They didn't know this was a whole different continent. That's how lost they were. Later, they named it the Americans after an Italian explorer, Emargio Vespucci, who figured out it really was a new continent, or more precisely, two new continents, North and South America. Many Europeans simply referred to it as the New World because it was not on any of the maps, and everything seemed strange and new to them. So this was almost alien to them. They didn't know there was like another continent out there, let alone two continents, the North and South America. For Europeans, the New World promised not only new land, but incredible riches. They found gold, silver, sugar, tobacco, lumber, animal furs, and a host of other resources. European nations sent armies to fight over these riches, and they sent settlers to harvest them. As you probably know, Columbus was not the first person to find the Americas. European explorers and settlers encountered people everywhere they went. These were the original or native people of the Americas because they had lived on the land before anyone else. Some Europeans called them Indians, although they really weren't in the Indies at all. So they called them Indians because they thought they were in the Indies. So, okay, if someone's in the Indies, they're called Indians. Somehow that name stuck for a while despite it being completely incorrect. Starting on the third paragraph at the bottom of page 6. Beginning in 1492, many things began to change for the indigenous, which means native, people of North and South America. For some, the change came quickly. This was especially true in places such as Mexico and Peru, where the Aztec and Inca empires ruled. The civilizations fell quickly to Spanish conquerors. The Spanish brought their powerful guns, steel swords, and horses. They and all other Europeans also brought diseases against which the native people had no natural defenses. By the end of the 1500s, Spanish soldiers and diseases wiped out many groups of people from Mexico through South America. So they didn't intentionally bring these diseases at first. It was just a side effect. They were living in a different part of the world. They had different sicknesses and illnesses. Their bodies had different antibodies to protect them than the Native Americans. So imagine if you go to a different country now, you are still likely to get sick just because there's different bacteria that you're not used to because you've grown up or you live in a specific spot. I say at first because later on down the line, the settlers and conquerors kind of exploited this, and then they would do things like spreading smallpox and purposely giving these diseases to the natives just so they could have another way of taking their land. So at first it wasn't on purpose, but then some groups later on would exploit this. Picking up on page 7. Changes were more gradual for Native Americans and the part of North America that later became the United States. So, like we talked about in our Unit 3 and early American civilizations, down in South America, the Aztec, Maya, and Inca, the Spanish came in and there was pretty much conflict immediately and things changed rapidly in a couple hundred years. In America, it was a lot slower. At first, there was trading, there was bargaining, they were sharing goods, they were teaching one another. This wasn't immediately the Europeans coming over and then stealing everything, at first it was pretty tame, but as time would go on, especially if you look at America now, you can tell that they mostly got what they wanted. Second paragraph on page 7, the English. The English settled at Jamestown, Virginia, where they built a fort in 1607 CE. There, Captain John Smith met Pocahontas and her tribe, the Powhatan. A few years later, in 1620, the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock. They interacted with the Wampanga people, including a man called Tisquantum, also known as Squanto, who helped them learn to survive. The Pilgrims were grateful to Squanto for his help. According to some historical records, the Pilgrims and Native Americans came together for a meal to share the bounty of their harvest. Today we remember and celebrate this meal as Thanksgiving. So even the origin of Thanksgiving was exchanging some of these tips about how to survive, exchanging some goods and foods. It was pretty friendly, and they were coming together to basically keep the other groups from dying. But continuing on, as with the story of Columbus, the story of Thanksgiving is only a fragment of a much larger story about Native Americans and the impact Europeans had on their world. Unfortunately, the themes of the Thanksgiving story, such as cooperation, friendship, and gratitude, are not common in the history of relation between Native Americans and Europeans. So you even look back to Thanksgiving and we think of that as like this perfect time where everyone was happy and came together. That was only like one happy little moment towards the beginning before there were hundreds of years of torment and torture and abuse to these people that really hadn't antagonized us or deserved it in any way. So I want you to take a moment. We have our guided notes. Take a moment and just write down 3 key facts that you think we should take away from this. What did we learn about the settlement and exploration of America? Think about the early parts of it. Think about the ending of it. Think about how we treated one another. So some key notes I found listed here. I would write 1492 is the age of discovery. This is when many explorers traveled the Atlantic Ocean. Many other countries, like the English and French, set out to conquer and colonize North America. So you even could see a lot of Southern America, cities like New Orleans, states like Louisiana. These were originally French territories that we got. And lastly, Jamestown, Virginia, we have the origin of Thanksgiving, which is sharing tips to survival. This was not common behavior, though. This was not something that would continue forever, us treating each other with like this kind of human decency. Also, pictured above me right here, that's a picture of Christopher Columbus. Not exactly the most friendly looking guy in the first place. Kind of has had a reputation drop in years once we find out more and more of the things that the settlers did to mistreat the indigenous folk. But that is a photo of him of what we believe he looked like. It is a painting, of course. Next up, we have page 8 through 10. It's a changing world, west and east. We're going to talk about some of the differences between both. Starting at the top of page 8. If you were a Native American boy or girl somewhere on the Great Plains during the 1500s or 1600s, European explorers existed mainly in rumors and campfire tales. In other words, most plain tribes didn't meet many Europeans at first, but they probably did hear stories about them. Where did these stories come from? Native Americans usually traded with neighboring tribes. Each tribe had something the other tribe wanted or needed. They traded animal furs, plants, herbs, pottery, jewelry, tools, or weapons made from various stones, bones, woods, or shells. Whenever they traded things, they also talked and shared news. So if you were trading with another tribe and they said, oh, hey, we heard that up the river or to the north there were some settlers there and they might be coming on this direction, that was their version of an information network and how they could spread news. Around the fires at night, they shared stories of strange men from distant lands. Some have said these men came from the sea itself, while others told of giant sailing ships. These strange men had beards and they wore metal armor on their bodies. They carried powerful weapons that made the sound of thunder echo through the forest and canyons. They also rode on great beasts called horses. Native Americans had never seen any of these things before Europeans arrived, so this was all entirely new and foreign to them. On the other hand, change was somewhat swifter for tribes in the east. So, from Florida all the way up to Maine and Canada, ships carrying eager and adventurous Europeans arrived. They came from Europe, England, France, Spain, the Netherlands, and other countries. They did not come simply to explore the land, hunt for valuable furs, and take treasure back to their homes in the so called New World. They came to stay, so this wasn't just a one off trip to take some stuff home. In eastern tribes, life became very challenging as Europeans moved in and established farms, towns, and cities. So think of the original 13 colonies. All of them are on the east coast of America, near the Atlantic Ocean, because that's the closest route from Europe. All the ones on the western side of America, they did not see as many of these settlers for a long time. So in the east, this all changed very quickly, while in the west, it was very slow until the settlers got all the way out there. European settlers were interested in two things. European settlers were interested in two things even more valuable than furs. First, they needed information to aid their survival, which Native Americans had in great supply. Native Americans showed settlers how to grow native plants like corn, beans, and tobacco. They taught them where to hunt for their own beaver, buffalo, and bear hides. They taught them the secrets of the forest and mountains and rivers and taught them about other tribes. So they didn't realize they were giving what would maybe eventually become their enemies or their worst nightmare all this information about how to survive and their best tactics. You would also think about these people who you're going to a new place, you're meeting someone, and like out of generosity for the most part, they're showing you and teaching you all these things before they just took advantage of them and exploited all of this. Second, settlers wanted land. English settlers established 13 colonies on the East Coast. Over time, the Native American tribes in the area lost most of their land or were forced to move to reservations as European settlers built farms, roads, factories, and towns. A reservation is basically a small plot of land that the American government or a town or a form of government would give to these Native Americans and say, this is where you stay now. This small part of land is yours. You're allowed to live there. But all that other land you guys lived on, that's now ours. We're taking that exclusively for ourselves. You're not allowed to be there. So it was almost like a sort of prison. It was a way of saying, here you go. You can have one tiny drop and we'll take everything else. Gradually, the settlers ventured away from the East Coast and moved over the Appalachian Mountains. So this is now, we're leaving the East where we took over rapidly and we took this land, and now they're slowly starting to spread west. They encountered the vast landscape of the American West. To them, it must have seemed like a land of opportunity, as much expansion and settlement was no longer possible in Europe. Europe already was pretty packed. Everyone had already chalked up what was theirs. Here, if you could get there quick enough and put your name in the ground, it was yours. Flipping the page to page 10. In 1776, these 13 colonies became the United States, and its government had a plan to make the new nation strong and powerful. The U.S. government seized land where Native American tribes lived. Many tribes fought back, but they could not prevent their land from being taken. The Cherokee people, for example, were one of the last large, powerful tribes in the woodlands of the southeastern United States. As the United States expanded its reach during the early 1800s, more and more settlers broke on the Cherokee lands, creating tensions that boiled over into war. The Cherokee tried to adapt to life as farmers and live according to laws of the United States. Ultimately, though, the U.S. government, under President Andrew Jackson, decided there was no more room for the Cherokee or any other tribes. With the Indian Removal Act of 1830, the Cherokee and other tribes east of the Mississippi River were forced to move west to the newly established Indian Territory in what would later become Oklahoma. Thousands of Cherokee and Native Americans died on the long walk westward, a journey remembered today as the Trail of Tears. The Cherokee experience, including the tension, wars, and forced relocation, so forced movement to the reservation land, was a narrative that played out again and again with other Native American tribes during the 1800s. So all tribes went through this process at one point. It may not have been as bloody and have as many casualties as it did with the Cherokees, but it was still a process all of them had to go through. As you will learn, there are many sad, tragic chapters in the Native American story. The Native American way of life, which had existed for thousands of years before Europeans' lives, was seriously threatened. Fortunately, however, Native American culture did not vanish. Although it was not easy, many Native American tribes did survive and redefine themselves to become a part of a new nation, the United States. Their age-old traditions are still celebrated, and they still walk upon the land they love. So Native Americans are still around today. There are still reservations, and this culture is still preserved to a pretty decent degree. I wouldn't say even most of it or the majority is just because of the amount of damage and destruction that a lot of colonists caused. But there is still a way to celebrate it and respect it. You even look at a book we're reading like right now, we're still taking the time and effort to teach about these people that were seriously mistreated. So I want you to take a moment, think about for your guided notes what the difference between the East and the West was. Think about what happened in the East and what happened to the West, and maybe mention in your notes what happened to the Cherokee. Here's an example of my guided notes. I said that Eastern tribes had to deal with more and more settlers, especially when you look at the Western tribes. Eastern tribes had it worse off at the beginning. Settlers wanted more eastern land, so they forced natives to reservations. So they wanted this land, they just forced them out with their military might. We have the creation of the United States in 1776. We have the 13 colonies that came together, but then they had to seize more tribe land because they were expanding as a nation. And lastly, I would just mention the Trail of Tears / Tribes Fought Back. It's also important to mention the Trail of Tears was called the Trail of Tears because this was a slow, sad march from the Cherokees from their previous land where they had spent thousands of years to what would become Oklahoma. It's called the Trail of Tears because it was a very depressing, melancholic sight. It was a lot of people who had lost their entire life. They lost family members. They had lost everything they had ever known in their homes. Think about the destruction and what they had went through and their state of mind when they were forced to being marched by the government. On page 11, we have a very short paragraph about horses. We're going to talk more about some of the animals that were very special and sacred to the Native Americans, but I want to take a moment just to take these short notes on horses. So, when you think of horses, you think of like running through the plains of America, but they were originally not from America. So, starting on page 11, the Spanish brought many horses from Europe. They traded some horses to Native Americans, but many more simply escaped into the wild. Native Americans learned to train and ride horses, and they eventually transformed the way of life for many tribes. This is especially true on the Great Plains. The Great Plains is the area between the east and west coast. It's that middle part of America. It's the like really flat part for the most place. This was especially true on the Great Plains, where horses were made hunting, traveling, and fighting much easier. So if you had a horse, it was a lot easier to hunt down prey that was faster. It was easier to go trade with tribes who are farther away. And if you are fighting, you have the advantage if you're on a horse because you're higher off the ground, you're quicker, and then you can't be reached by your opponent. So, the last part of our assignment for the day, on the back, on the bottom of your guided notes, we have a short race response. This is just answering our big question for the day that I have told us to think about towards the beginning. So, how did European settlers impact Native American lives? So, you have to restate Native Americans' lives were impacted by the Europeans, or Native Americans were impacted by blank. Think of some of our answers. Think about what happened to their homes. Think about at the very beginning when they met each other, what did they do? Think about how it changed the Native Americans' lives today. There's plenty of things you can pick from. Make sure you also explain that evidence. But at the bottom of page 48, you notice that there's not enough space really for you to write this out. You can do this on a separate piece of notebook paper and just text me the photo there. So I have my phone number there. You have my email address. Just make sure that you restate, answer, cite, and explain, and then take a photo, send it my way. Wrapping up for the day. Make sure that you've submitted your essay from yesterday via text to me, and make sure you submit today's race response to me as well. Make sure you have finished up your iReady and reading log for this week. So we're reading about 30 minutes a day, and you're doing 45 minutes of iReady math and 45 minutes of iReady reading. We're going to check those when we have our reports on Sunday. For tomorrow, I'm not going to have a video posted for myself, but there is going to be a link beneath this the video right now in the description for an enrichment video on chapter 2. So tomorrow I want you to watch that video, and then for chapter 2 tomorrow you have a few elements. You're going to practice some vocabulary yourself at the top. It's just finishing the sentence, and then I want you to attempt note-taking yourself. There's only 4 little headers in chapter 2. I want you to attempt filling in all of those boxes just with what you think is important, and then I will come back with my new video on Monday. In the meantime, scholars, I hope to see a lot of you guys in the Google Hangouts that we're going to be having. I was really excited to see how many people RSVP'd and showed like they were really excited to get out there. I'm just really excited to see some of you guys, and I know you're really excited to see some of your friends. In the meantime, if you have any questions, you can again give me a call or text, and I'll help you guys out the best I can. Thank you and have a great day. Stay safe.